Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this, the third in THI Australia's digital conversation series. Following our first two webinars, the first with the Prime Minister of the Hellenic Republic, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, and the second with Yana Angelopoulou Daskalaki, the chair of the committee for the 200-year commemoration of the Greek War of Independence, we're now delighted to present the wonderful Stephen Fry in conversation with a person well known to Australian audiences, David Hill. THI Australia is proud to be part of a worldwide philanthropic movement that was born out of Greece's financial crisis, with the stated aim of harnessing the power of the diaspora in both its Hellenic and Philhellenic forms at a critical moment in the history of the modern Greek nation. For those who have yet to hear about our charitable work among the vulnerable, please check us out. But now to our very special guest, the inimitable Stephen Fry. Stephen's bio is so diverse and dense that it's extremely challenging to encapsulate his achievements in a 3-minute intro. Perhaps it's easier to define him by what he is not. Stephen has never played Test cricket for England. He wasn't one of the Beatles, and he definitely should not be allowed to preside over a court-martial again after General Melchert's frighteningly biased prosecution of Blackadder for the murder of his carrier pigeon, Speckled Jim. But he's done virtually everything else and done it well. Author, actor, screenwriter, playwright, journalist, poet, comedian, television presenter, broadcaster, podcaster, and film director, Stephen straddles the cultural scene like a virtual Olympian god. And the analogy is not without relevance here, for Stephen is also a Philhellene in the best possible sense of the word. And for that, he was recently honoured by the Hellenic Republic with the award of Grand Commander of the Order of the Phoenix, the highest award presented to a non-Greek for their advocacy and passion for Greece and all she represents. So I could be not more delighted to introduce to our audience today the one and only Stephen Fry in conversation with David Hill, among other things a former managing director of the ABC and for 10 years the inaugural chair of the International Committee for the Return of the Parthenon Sculptures. I'm sure that their conversation will be both illuminating and entertaining. And to close the session, I will ask the co-founder and chair of THI globally, Andrew Liveris, to offer a vote of thanks to our special guest and to tell you a little more about THI's mission in Greece. David, over to you.
Thanks, Nick, and good morning to everyone in Australia, and hello to wherever you are around the world, and a special welcome and a good evening to the wonderful Stephen Fry in Los Angeles. Welcome, Stephen.
Oh, thank you. Kalimera. Kalimera say Oruz.
Yes. What brings you to America this time?
Well, I'm actually in the middle of filming a TV series for Hulu Disney. I don't know if you ever listened to a podcast or saw a documentary about a company called Theranos it's a good Greek sounding word, isn't it? In the middle of the teens, about 5 or 6 years ago, it was everywhere. The founder of it, Elizabeth Holmes, was on the front of Time magazine. She was the new Steve Jobs. She was pointing to the future of healthcare. They came up with this extraordinary technology where one prick of the finger could read all hundreds of diseases and cancers and upcoming problems and so on, and it was just going to transform the healthcare scene. Only, of course, it didn't work. And yet, despite hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of investment from people like George Shultz, the ex-Secretary of State, and the Clintons, and Rupert Murdoch, your charming and lovely Australian press baron, and many, many others, they all poured money into it and they all lost everything. How I cried when I discovered that Rupert Murdoch had lost money, and it's an extraordinary story, and actually it has some very sad sides, particularly the character I'm playing, because the whole thing came crashing down, and she's now on trial. She's being played by Amanda Seyfried in this series, and I'm playing the head of science, who took his own life. So it's a proper old drama, but I'm really enjoying it, shooting out here.
Stephen, you're probably the best known figure in the world as a Philhellene or Philhellene. But what first attracted you to Greece? And can you remember your first visit to Greece?
Well, it goes a long way back, David, to when I was a child. And I say this, and it honestly is true. It's not one of those sort of greasy bits of British self-effacing modesty or anything. But genuinely, when I was really very young, I wasn't any good at anything. I was sent away to a prep school, a boarding school, when I was 7, a long way from home. And all the boys were good at sports and music and drawing. And I mean, they weren't all good at, each one of them wasn't all good at everything, but there was nothing I felt I was good at. And then I realized that there was one thing I loved that nobody else seemed interested in, and that was language itself and storytelling. So I kind of got my popularity by telling stories after lights out in the dormitories. I would just make up stories and tell stories. And then I discovered Greek myths. I was about 7 or 8. And so I would tell these stories because I thought they were the best stories imaginable and better than I could ever make up. So I'd tell the story of Perseus and Medusa or something. And people loved me for it. So of course, the vanity of humanity is such that if someone admires you for something you do or likes a talent you have, you naturally try to burnish it. And then I loved Latin. We were taught Latin as a matter of course at school. And because I was quite proficient at it, the Latin teacher said to me, would I like to learn Greek? And I was about 9, I think, by this time. And I said, yeah, go on. And he privately gave me lessons. And of course, as soon as I discovered it had another alphabet, I was like a code, so I could write to people using, I wrote my name Stephanos Fru with an ypsilon at the end, and I just loved it. And I loved particularly, and I still do to this day, finding Greek in our language, just discovering it in obvious forms at first, like telephone or words like that are so naturally and clearly Greek, or grammar or something. And I remember a chapter in this book where they always gave you new vocabulary and told you how this particular word has made a journey into English. And there was a verb, thaumazein, which means to marvel, to wonder at. And it said, this is easily remembered by thinking of the English word thaumaturge. Most 9-year-olds have not heard the English word thaumaturge. Let's be honest, most 90-year-olds haven't heard the English word thaumaturge, but I've never forgotten it for that reason. So in a sense, Greek for me was like a passport into a magical kingdom that I could control because none of my friends really had it. But despite them not knowing about Greek, the language, or being that proficient in Greek history or mythology, without their knowing it, it was deep in the DNA of the language they used unknowingly. And so my knowing it gave me a kind of, it's not a control thing, but it was just like an exciting feeling that I belonged to a very special club that they didn't. And that was the club of being sort of au fait with and excited about Greece. And this carried on and I suppose I forgot about it in a way. I mean, I lived with it and I loved Greece. And then I first went very late, I have to say. My parents didn't go on holiday. My father regarded holidays as something of a waste of time. He couldn't quite see the point. And so I was at university before I went. Like Oscar Wilde, I went when I was an undergraduate. And in a way, it was worth waiting for because it was everything I'd hoped for the first time to see Athens and to see Delphi and Olympia and to see Liveris and Crete and Evia and Delos, to go on that awful seasick making ferry to Delos. I mean, this was beyond anything I could possibly have imagined, and it still gives me a thrill that visiting no other country can give me.
Is Delphi your favorite spot?
Delphi is, I think, yes. As you probably know, it's the Greeks called it the omphalos, the navel stone, the umbilical center of their world. And Gaia, the mother goddess of the earth, lived under there, and she sent her breath up, and it was interpreted by the Pythia, the priestesses of the oracle there, exactly. And when you go, you see these different levels, and behind it there's a wonderful stadion, a wonderful running track, and so you see almost every aspect of Greek civilization is there: the athletics, the games, the oracle, the mystery of the gods, the mysteries of oracular divination, and the temples, and a sense of a wonderful place spread out in the sky. And there is this, there is this spring underneath, and this slight sort of gas that comes up. And,
Stephen, you share with me and a lot of people who are watching this interview a passionate belief that the beautiful sculptures and statues of the Parthenon that were ripped away by Lord Elgin 200 years ago should be returned from the British Museum to Athens. Where did that conviction come from with you?
Actually, I tell you, it was my friend Christopher Hitchens, the journalist and writer and polemicist and contrarian, so many words to use about him, a genius really of language and ideas, and deeply missed, a great figure. And he in turn was influenced by Melina Mercouri, the great Greek actress and activist, herself a member of parliament, I think the longest serving minister of culture in the history of the modern Greek Republic. And well, it's not as if there were ministers of culture.
I think she was the first.
Modern Greek Republic. She was the first, exactly, and the longest serving, and a marvelous woman. And Christopher told me about how she had passionately told him the story of Elgin and the theft of these, under the guise of purchasing what is called a firman, a document from the Turks who of course were angry, because this was about 200 years ago. It was just on the brink of the Greek War of Independence, and Byron wrote a furious book against Elgin called The Rage of Minerva, I think it's called, which is he was straight away saw that this was a monstrous crime. There's something very special about the Parthenon. And there are, of course, many people in museums and libraries who are almost genetically programmed to hate the idea of deacquisition, or whatever word you want to use. And they believe that it's a slippery slope. You give away one thing to one country and you'll have to give away your entire collection, and it would have to be dispersed around the world. Well, slippery slope, of course, as followers of logic and Aristotle will know, is a fallacy, but nonetheless, that's kind of just being a bit kind of cute about it. I think the point is we have to recognize there is something special about the Parthenon to Athens. It's not just a building, it is a foundational element in the very nature of what Athens is. Parthenon comes from the Greek word for the virgin, of course. Parthenon means virgin, and Athena, the virgin goddess, who's the patroness of the city, gave it its name, therefore. And it has very, very special qualities as a primary element of modern architecture to this day. It is unsurpassed in its grace and its beauty and its achievement. And I think there is a way of returning it, which would solve so many problems, really. And that is, we live in a time where it's, of course, technically possible to create a fantastic, let's call it the Parthenon experience, in the British Museum, where the Elgin marbles reside. Now, because they're marbles, of course, they can be cast. A cast can be made of them. So the British Museum can keep an almost identical cast of everything they've had for the last 200 years, and then pack up and send the originals by lorry and train and boat, and filmed. We would watch them disassemble these elements, the friezes from the metopes and the entablature of the great building. We'd watch it go, and then we'd watch it be placed in the magnificent new Acropolis Museum in Athens. And that Parthenon experience at the British Museum would be, you'd get everything that you get now, plus you would see this magical moment in which they were restored to their rightful place. And it would be such a classy act. And Britain, frankly, needs the world to see it do something classy for a change. After the wrench of Brexit and the nonsense of much of our behavior in the world as football fans and in other ways.
We now have a situation where globally there is overwhelming support for Britain to return the Parthenon sculptures.
Yeah.
Even overwhelming British public opinion.
Absolutely.
And yet the British Museum and the British government just remains totally intransigent.
Will that ever change? Disgrace, and I think it will. I think it's inevitable that it will. It's like when I was arguing, as so many of us were, for equal age of consent in sex for between same-sex and same-sex marriage, and people were saying it's a pipe dream. Stephen, do you seriously think this could happen? And in 1988 and in 1990s, it did seem a pipe dream. It seemed a pipe dream that it could ever happen in Australia. I remember an Australian gay couple getting married on British soil at the in Canberra, because that was the only way they could. And it was said, oh, it'll never happen in Australia, never happen. Well, of course it will. Things that seem impossible do happen. And in a sense, that's the gift that the Greeks have given us, that reaching. One of the things I so love about Greek mythology is that it tells the story of Greece itself. Because if you look at the Mediterranean thousands of years ago, there was a civilization that lasted 5,000 years of extraordinary power and beauty, and that was the Egyptian civilization. But it never changed, because in humanity there was never this idea that you should progress, that you should learn new things, do new things, strive towards perfection, strive towards being better, strive towards improving and understanding, reach for the sun. And the Egyptians didn't do that. They kept the same style of architecture for thousands of years. You have to be an Egyptologist to be able to determine one kingdom from another, because they were satisfied. They had their civilization. But the Greeks had this different idea. And I guess it puzzled them themselves. Why are we different? Why do we have this different way of living, this different way of, each generation seems better than the one before. And the story of Greek myth is the story of fathers castrating sons in the first case of the gods, but also over toppling their fathers and reaching too high. Usually there's a lot of hubris about it, because the Greeks were aware that you could try too hard. Icarus flying to the sun, Phaeton, in his sun carriage as well. And that is the invention of, for good or ill, what we think of as the Western culture, the Western civilization, this idea that it is right to try and discover new things, pass them on, and for each generation to be better, to be more knowledgeable, to have a better technology, a better understanding of how things work, and not to be settled by a hierarchy or a religion that told you this is the case, this is how things are, don't question. The Greeks had an agnosis and discovery, that you find things out, and that is a miracle.
Stephen, you've written a riveting and very readable trilogy about ancient Greece, mythos, about mythology, the heroes, and Troy. Out of all of that, is there a favourite character?
Well, I suppose I'd say the thing about the characters in Greek myth, as compared to nearly all mythic structures and stories that I know or have come across, are so filled with ambiguity, complexity, juice, a comedy, as well as passion, and because I suppose there's something very realistic and practical about the Greek way of looking at things as well. If you look at the world, it is majestic and beautiful. It inspires awe. Its beauty and its majesty are almost beyond comprehension. So the gods must be like that too. But the world is also capricious and mean and cruel and unjust, totally inequitable. and therefore the gods must be like that too. In other words, they must be majestic and remarkable and beautiful, but also wicked and lustful and mean and capricious and unfair. And so they people their gods with all these qualities. And that's what makes them so fabulous and so believable. Because if they really were immortals, they would be like that.
But do you have a favorite?
And so, yes, I'm coming to that. I do give long answers. I apologize. So my favorites are those which have precisely those qualities of both beauty and grace and wickedness. And that would be Hermes, I think, in the male gods. He's the god of mischief, of liars, of cheats and swindlers. He could be very, very cruel. The way he, kills Argo, the sentinel, is vicious. But he's also beautiful and graceful and witty and funny and charming and silly. There's something marvelous about Hermes. The Romans called him Mercury. He's the quicksilver god, of course. And he's also the god of storytellers, and of actors and comedians, I think.
I was going to ask, of which of the Greek gods would you like to be?
Well, so interesting. I think Athena. We can all put ourselves in the position of Paris, who, as you probably know, was selected to give the apple of what became known as the apple of discord. Eris, the goddess of discord, had rolled it at this wedding feast, and it had "Te Caliste" written on it, to the fairest. And so the Queen of Heaven, Hera, said, "Well, I'll have that then. That'll be me." And Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, said, "No, I think it must obviously go to me." And Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warcraft and many other things, she said, "No, it must go to me." And so, of course, they were going to have a terrible fight about who. And they decided to give the job to Paris, young Paris, who was living the life of a shepherd on Mount Ida by Troy. And he was offered by Hera power and imperial might, majesty by Hera, if he gave her the apple. And Athena said, "I'll give you wisdom, which is worth more than all those things. And wisdom and knowledge, the ability to see into the hearts of men and of gods." But Aphrodite said, "I'll give you love." And she showed him a picture of Helen of Troy. So, of course, stupid man, he went for Helen, as all humans will. He went for love and beauty and sex instead of either power or knowledge and wisdom. Well, I like to think I would have chosen Athena, not just because I'm gay.
Well, I think that's a good choice.
Wouldn't have interested me quite so much if she'd offered a boy just as beautiful. I still like to think that I would have gone for Athena, but for the canny reason that wisdom will probably give you the reputation and a gloss and a kind of appeal that gets you sex anyway, if I want to put it that way.
Well, I thought you would have chosen Zeus.
Oh, as a god. I mean, I love Zeus, of course I do. Absolutely. And I love the mistakes he makes and the frustration he feels, and the fact that he's basically out of control. He's not like Marlon Brando.
And not accountable to anybody.
But he's a don. He's a mafia don, and the gods are like a mafia family, but he's more like Don Michael in The Godfather 2 and 3. He sort of loses control of his children, and he's bossed about really by his wife and his daughters, and less by his sons. But he is, it's a wonderful thing. He is powerful and majestic. He has the thunderbolt, the eagle, the oak tree. All the symbols of majesty are his. But most of the stories about Zeus are either his lust, going wrong and making terrible mistakes through it, fundamental mistakes. After all, Helen of Troy is Zeus's daughter by Leda, as in the swan. He turns himself into a swan, and Helen is one of his children from that union, the other being Clytemnestra, and there were two more, Castor and Pollux, the twins, of course. Sorry, I'm babbling away.
I could listen to each of your answers for hours. Before we leave the gods, I read somewhere or saw you interviewed once. You nearly chose a career as an Anglican priest.
Yes, yes, yes. Almost everything about the Anglican ministry of communion appeals to me. The language of Thomas Cranmer, who wrote the prayer book, some bits of which I can still quote by heart. It's sort of crazy, isn't it? The prayers, the compline, the morning service, the general confession, the language of it, and of course the language of the King James Bible, and the liturgy of the Anglican communion. I find just so beautiful, and the architecture, of course, which, to be fair, most of British church architecture was originally Catholic, but has become Anglican since Henry VIII. And the music, obviously, the music is just a stunning feature of it. It's the tiniest little drawback, the little fly in the ointment, is that I don't actually believe in the Trinity, or I couldn't in any honesty recite the creed. I mean, I can recite it as an act of memory. I believe in God the Father, etc., etc. But it would be a lie, and it's pointless to pretend otherwise. I just don't think it's true. It would be lovely, would it were. And I feel a bit like who's the character? There's a character in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. Bertram, his name is Crawford. Crawford, his name is. That's right. He says. He gives this marvelous speech about what a good bishop he would have made and what marvelous sermons he would have given and so on. And you can see through Fanny, the heroine, that she's completely contemptuous of him because it never at any point does he mention faith or piety or anything of that nature. And I think I would make a magnificent bishop, or indeed I'll go for it, archbishop. But for this one slight problem is that I don't believe, and that's not good enough. Now, of course, doubt is an important part of faith, but you've got to have the faith as well as the doubt, despite Augustine and the things.
Can I ask you about one of your modern heroes, Oscar Wilde?
Yeah.
And how much do you think Oscar Wilde has shaped you? How much of Oscar Wilde is in you?
I think an enormous amount. I'll tell a story. I'll try and compress it as much as possible, but I think it's a sort of revealing one. I grew up in the countryside. It's very hard for an Australian to imagine the massive distances involved. I was at least 12 miles from the nearest city. I know you can't even picture such huge open spaces as I was a victim of in my country existence as a child. Yes, I know it's tiny England, but it seemed like a remote country existence. I had a bicycle and that's it. But every 2 weeks, a van, a pantechnicon would come, a mobile library would come, and about half a mile from the house would stop at a crossroads. Anyway, one Sunday I was watching television. Parents didn't really allow television, but they didn't ban it, but there was only a tiny one about that big. It was black and white. And I saw a film, and I didn't know what it was. It had started before I watched it, so I missed the title. But I remember it had the most remarkable language in it. There was a moment when a young man says to a beautiful young woman, I hope you will not be in any way offended if I say that you seem to me to be the visible personification of absolute perfection. And I remember I felt like I had been hit when I heard that. I knew language was something you could use to say, could you pass the mustard, or I hate you, or I'm going out, or, but that it could seduce, it could dance on the tongue like that. I hope I will not offend you if I say that you seem to me to be the visible personification of absolute perfection. I also knew that it was funny. It was funny because it was a declaration of love, and love in English, even though I couldn't have expressed it in that way, should be an Anglo-Saxon. I love you. You are lovely. But well, the visible personification of absolute perfection is just Latin phrases coming out, and to use them of something of passion is sort of a contradiction, and yet it's so beautiful. And anyway, I ran to my mother after this film had finished and said, Mummy, would you be offended if I said that you seem to me to be the visible personification of absolute perfection? And she said, what are you talking about? And I explained I'd seen this strange film, and it wasn't Shakespeare, but it wasn't modern, and eventually she understood I was talking about the importance of being earnest. And so they didn't have a copy of the play in the house, so I waited for this library to come, this mobile library, and I went up the steps and found the book and took it home. It was 4 plays, you know, Woman of No Importance, Ideal Husband, Lady Windermere's Fan, and The Importance of Being Earnest. And I read them cover to cover, back and forth. I mean, just kept reading, got to the end, started again, got to the end, started again. It was just a complete, there are many people watching this thing who will have had the same experience when they first heard the Beatles, or they first heard, I don't know, Snoop Dogg, or whatever it is. You know, it's one of those moments that hits you when you're young, when something totally new invades your senses and changes the way you look at everything. But there was more to come, because I went back 2 weeks later and said, have you got any more by this Oscar Wilde? And there was a complete works. So I read that. Much of it I didn't understand. I was, you know, essays like The Soul of Man Under Socialism and The Decay of Lying were too sophisticated for me, but there was much I did. And then I came back, and then I went back and said, have you got anything more? And the librarian said, well, if that's the complete works, there won't be any more. And so I looked around the library and I suddenly saw this book called The Trials of Oscar Wilde. So I said, can I take that out? She gave me a strange look, but she stamped it out. I thought, why is she looking at me like that? And I took the book, and it was the story of the trials of Oscar Wilde. And as I read, my heart began to sink as I saw what happened to this extraordinary man, because it painted this picture of someone who was wise and kind and a great friend. I mean, yes, he lived a life of dissipation, as the Victorians would think of it. He liked to drink, he liked to party, he had a lover, but he was not a primped, peacocky, vain, you know, in the way that some people think of him. And then this terrible calamity befell him, the greatest scandal of the age. And as I was reading it, what was so strong in my mind was, of course, was that the sin he had committed was to do with the nature that I knew instinctively and absolutely I shared. This was my nature too, in other words, as we now say, my sexuality. And it was like the boom of a distant gun, or the knell of a tolling bell to me, that this was going to be my life too, that it would end in scandal or shame or exile or disgrace of some kind, and that all complete stifling of myself. And it was simultaneously wonderful to think that this great hero, this lord of language, should be like me, but also terrible to think that the fate could befall someone so great. So how, therefore, it would befall someone so much lesser. So in that sense, I immediately had this kinship with Oscar. And then I found out more and more about him and his circle. And yeah, he was profoundly an influence on me. And I couldn't believe it then when in 1995, I had a meeting with a producer and director who asked me to play him in a film. And that was one of the most marvelous experiences to play him. I mean, an honor and a responsibility and terrifying. I so nearly said no because I didn't want to screw it up, but then I thought, well, I couldn't bear it if someone else did. So, and to have his grandson, Oscar's grandson, Merlin Holland, on the set as a consultant was pretty remarkable.
But has it ever been pointed out to you that there are elements of your character or personality that are very Wilde?
Well, I would love to think that some of it had rubbed off on me, at least. Yeah, I mean, and I do have a sort of large fleshy face as he did, and if I part the hair in the middle, I can certainly look a bit like him. I wouldn't kid myself that I have his intellectual prowess, though he has led me to places and to ways of looking at the world that I share with him. And but I'll tell you something, because you know, tragedy like his death in Paris in 1900, a lonely man in exile who'd been spurned and hated, and he had every reason perhaps to believe that his work would never be rediscovered because his scandal would always come first. He would be that man, that corrupt man. But you know, a few years ago, the Irish government, together with the particular department in France responsible, raised money to renew and restore the grave, this wonderful sarcophagus that had been built by Jacob Epstein in Père Lachaise in Paris, where he died. And they restored it, but the reason it was restored, the reason it had to be restored, was the thing that still makes me choke. is because it had been kissed so many times that the acid had worked into the marble, that it had simply been loved too much. People from all over the world came and still come. I've been so many times to see it myself. And you see it now covered in Post-it notes, covered in Post-it notes. We love you, Oscar. Thank you, Oscar. Oscar, they'll never bring you down, you know? So I'm going a bit now. It still moves me because, you know, he means so much. He is, I used to, when I first started doing television, and you get invited to universities and colleges to give talks and so on. And it used to be in the very early days that students, like when I was a student, they would have on their walls posters of Karl Marx and Jimi Hendrix, because what would save the world was revolutionary politics or rock and roll. But as the 80s and 90s happened, I saw this less and less because, I don't know, maybe because obviously the fall of the Berlin Wall and the idea that communism would save the world seemed ridiculous. And also the commercialization of music and the death of Lennon and Elvis and everything else. Somehow the joy had gone out of that too. And instead you would mostly see posters of Oscar and maybe Einstein, because students started to believe that if the world was going to be saved, it would be the life of the mind that saved it. And Oscar represented one side and Einstein another. And Oscar's, he is the student prince. You know, he is the patron saint of those who refuse to be fixed into a moral schema or a set of beliefs that they won't change. He's what he called the dynamic or artistic life. You know, he said once, people who want to be a grocer or a politician or a general or a judge will become so. That is their punishment. But people who do not know what they want to be or what they're going to be will become nothing. That is their reward. And he called that the artistic life or the dynamic life. And there are still millions around the world, and some of them are not well served by social media and other such things, who yearn for that voice of the gypsy, the bohemian, the, you know, I sort of say the person who'll never own a lawnmower, you know what I mean? Who, you know, the sort of anti-bourgeois, and I still think it's a deeply important strain in life to be that student who never stops being a student.
Yes.
And of course, above all, Wilde was a Hellenist. He was the greatest Hellenist that Dublin had ever sent to Oxford. Mahaffy, his teacher, who was a great professor of Greek, said so. And when he arrived at Magdalen, he won all the prizes in Greek. There's a great story of his Greek. You do these live exams at Oxford, which are called vivas, short for viva voce, live voice. And so as well as a written exam, you had to, and in these, you had to demonstrate a facility with New Testament Greek as well as classical Attic Greek. And so he was handed a New Testament in Greek, and it was sort of opened at random, and he was asked to translate at sight. So he looked, and he did completely fluently. It happened to be the Passion and Crucifixion of Christ. So he was reading through it, and they said, "Very good, Mr. Wilde." He put the book down, but he carried on translating. They said, "Mr. Wilde, you can stop now." And he carried on. Mr. Wilde stopped. He said, "No, do let me go on. I'm dying to see how it all turns out." Blissful. But I've been I'm in Los Angeles at the moment, and I'm not that far from a place called the Clark Library, which has one of the best collections of Oscariana outside the Pierpont Library in New York and various ones in Britain and Ireland. And it includes his lecture notes from Oxford. And he wrote lecture notes in Greek. That's how amazing he was. He would just write them in Greek, and you can see them there in his hand. Phenomenal.
He was a Phil Helene, as you are. You once said in a debate about arguing for the return of the Parthenon sculptures, you said, "We can never repay Greece." What did you mean?
Well, I was speaking, of course, closer to the time a few years ago when the sovereign debt crisis was crippling the Hellenic Republic quite appallingly, and there was talk of Grexit, if you remember, a Greek exit from there, and the northern prosperous countries of Europe their bankers were seemed to be quite happy for Greece to be in this terribly parlous state economically, the debt. So there was huge sovereign debt that Greece owed around these institutions, banks and ones that represented nation states. And that there was a real danger in the country. And I remember seeing a site that absolutely tore me to pieces. A BBC crew were covering this awful situation, and they wanted to show a sort of soup kitchen, free food being given out to Greek citizens, and it was a moving camera following this reporter who said around the corner there's a food queue, and the camera went round the corner, and there was a queue of Greek men lining up, and as soon as they saw the camera, they turned and went away because their pride was too great for them to be seen to be asking for charity food, and that just tore me to pieces. It's an awful thing to see these proud, independent people being reduced in this way and still retaining that dignity that they didn't want to be seen holding out a begging bowl. It was an awful moment. So when I was talking about we will always owe the Greeks more than they owe us, I was referring directly to that crisis of debt that Greece was going through. But it is, of course, true. We it's quite fashionable these days to say, we don't really, the Greeks didn't invent democracy or rhetoric or logic or mathematics, and of course it's true, mathematics grew up in Sumeria and Babylon and India and all kinds of other places, but it'd still be hard put to find anything greater or more beautiful than Euclid and Pythagoras and the establishment of the principles of logic that Aristotle laid down are, unassailable to this day. Unbelievable, and that's not even touching on Plato. And so, there is so much, and the poetry and the literature and the theatre. These achievements we owe Greece, and as I say, we can never repay, or at least the best way we can repay is to remember what this country and its culture and its history has given us. And particularly at this time, this bicentenary of the years of the savage war of independence, when they tried to shake off the yoke of the Ottoman Empire, and there are great anniversaries coming. For example, the death of Byron, and Lord Byron, a wonderful character.
A hero of yours, Byron?
Very much a hero. Perhaps the living embodiment of Hermes, sort of wicked and impish and delightful and funny and brilliant and dedicated to Greece. And that in his last great work is Don Juan. It has to be pronounced Juan, not Juan. He makes the rhyming insists that it's Juan. In Don Juan, which is in comic verse in an ottava rima, there's a sudden bit in the middle which goes into this lyric form, which is called the Isles of Greece. The Isles of Greece, the Isles of Greece, where burning Sappho loved and sung, where thrived the arts of love and peace, where Delos rose and Phoebus sung. It's an unbelievably beautiful, melancholy farewell, because it's saying, where is that Greece now? When is it going to rise again to throw off the tyrant's yoke? And he was, deeply worried that it wouldn't happen, and he went up to, he joined a military force to try his best to throw himself into it. And
of course, tragically, he was killed, or he died.
That's right.
Before Greece won the Battle of Independence.
He never saw it. But there are more statues to Byron in Greece than there are in his homeland.
Look, I certainly find, in fact, I'm amazed at the idolization of Byron in Greece, the extent of it. It's as if he won the War of Independence by himself.
Well, you have to find a voice and a face for things, and often, of course, it's historically absurd to pile so much into one person, just as we could say in Britain, hang on, let's reassess Churchill. Did he really win the war? But they become a symbol, a face of rebellion or a face of a nation. And there were many great soldiers and patriots of the Greek War of Independence, but whose names just didn't resonate around the world quite like Byron's, and perhaps that's a bit unfair and wrong. And Italy is, I suppose, in a similar kind of, people go to Italy and say, you look at these Italians now, they're all waiters. Hard to believe they were once Caesar and Mark Antony. And you think, well, that's absurd. You might just as well go to Birmingham and say, where are the Shakespeares? You can pick and choose. But in fact, of course, there have been many modern Greek people who've been very inspiring. And I'm as fond of Cavafy, the Constantino Cavafy, the Alexandrian Greek poet of the 20th century.
And Saphiris?
And yes, I mean, geniuses, absolutely wonderful. I mean, of course, my Greek isn't good enough to read. I have to rely on good translations. I mean, I can pick out the words, but you need the spirit of the language inside you to follow it. I think.
What about? Can I throw in as a modern hero, Mikos Theodorakis, who composed wonderful Greek music and the score of Zorba. He's still alive.
Absolutely.
He turned 96.
Well, it's incredible. And Irina Papas is still alive as well. I believe she's very unwell, but I think she's still alive, isn't she?
I don't know.
I believe she is. She's in the movie of Zorba the Greek as well.
With
Anthony Quinn and Kazantzakis, who also wrote The Last Temptation of Christ.
Yes.
Yeah, there's been a great sort of, there are, and I'm sure many people watching will say, oh, you haven't even scratched the surface of Greek literature, and I bet that's true, and I'm the first to admit my ignorance of many contemporary Greek voices.
Talking of achievement, you can look on an array of talent and achievement as an individual. Remarkable life you've led. What is the most important or valuable thing you think you've done with your life?
Oh, heavens, that's a tricky one, David. I've been incredibly lucky in that I've been able to move between writing and performing and, writing both fiction and, writing for things like the books on the Greek mythology or a book on poetry that I wrote. And so I don't just write, I've written novels and things. And it means that my life, whenever I get stuck in one direction, I can go down another. It's a big mansion and lots of rooms, and I'm incredibly fortunate. And I'm very aware that some people don't have the opportunity to try things out. But I think mostly it's that I've been allowed, the way I describe it, is I've been allowed to be a verb, not a noun. I can just, I'm allowed to do things, not to be something. It's a lot of people find themselves fixed as a this or a that. I'm it's a proud thing to say I'm a doctor or I'm a professor or I'm a farmer or whatever it might be. But I think it's psychologically so much better to say I work in medicine or I farm, just to use the verb, because it suggests you might also do so many other things, and all humans do and can. And one of the great advantages of atheism and not believing in a life after death is that you really do believe you have to fill, every unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, as Kipling put it. That you try every fruit of every tree of every orchard of the world, as Wilde put it. And some will be poisoned, and some will be too beautiful and addictive, and so on. But what's the point of not trying lots of different experiences? So in terms of an achievement, I wouldn't say that this novel or this book, or I guess in terms of influence on others, certainly in Britain, I made a documentary some years ago called The Secret Life of the Manic Depressive. And it was a time before mental health was in the conversation culturally or socially or in any other way, and certainly not politically either. I'm very glad to say that it has. And maybe that documentary in Britain at least helped a little. I went, I also went to America and spoke to some friends there, and it did have quite an impact in Britain. I think to talk about my own mental health and the real struggles I'd had over the years, including suicide attempts, and, the very kind of worst that mental health can throw at you. And
well, that's a good one to have at the top of your list.
Well, I think so, because it really is wonderful to see how it has genuinely
helped.
Helped. It seems to have done, changed
Yes.
people's, confidence in being able to speak about it. Yeah.
Finally, Stephen, we can't have an Australian interview without sport. we see that your beloved Norwich Football Club has fought its way successfully back into the English Premier League, the most competitive football league in the world. And I see on Sunday week at the opening of the new season, Norwich is playing the mighty Liverpool at home at Carrow Road. Will you be able to watch it?
I will be able to watch it, yes. And bizarrely, two seasons ago, when we were in the Premiership as well, it was Liverpool we played first then, and we nearly equalised. Let me put it that way. Listen, Norwich is a small club. It's one of the glories of sport is that you don't have to support the big clubs. Do
you miss being on the board?
No, not in the sense of looking at spreadsheets. I was not put on this planet to look at spreadsheets, and my brain just goes into fog. And to talk about money and so on and management things is just not what I'm no good at it. You need better people. So I left the board because I just wasn't any good at it, and I couldn't really make the meetings regularly. But I act as a kind of ambassador and social media tweeter for various causes that they ask me to. And obviously I do follow the club closely, and cricket as well. I adore cricket, and the Ashes coming up again, of course. And if
we'll be on opposite sides when
we will. I know. It's a thrilling thing, and it's one of the things I love about Australia is that there isn't that so much of a division between sports lovers and the artistic people. Everyone in Australia seems to get sport. Of course, there are people who grew up in school hating sport and hating the ochre culture as they saw it, of the manly kind of Australian side of things, and there was perhaps in the 50s and 60s and in the earlier days, I'm sure, a rather brutal kind of misogynistic and unpleasant side of sport, but that's true everywhere.
I think,
but that is changing,
it's
and
the same everywhere. And in retrospect, we all feel very bad about that era. But you've got to acknowledge that there's been great progress in attitudes.
Fantastic progress. It's wonderful, and to see women's sport rising and rising and rising in is just great as well. So it's doubled the pleasure that one can have.
Stephen, I've had a thoroughly exciting time with you today. It was a real privilege for me to have been asked to talk to you. Good luck with all of your adventures, which we follow very closely. And thank you from me for letting me talk to you. I want to hand you over now to Andrew Liveris, who is the co-founder and president of THI Global. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank
you, David. Boy, I didn't know you had such great moderator skills there. Although Stephen, maybe you made him look good, but I got to tell you, it was enlightening, stimulating, enjoyable to listen to your world and your universe. I'm an ardent Blackadder addict, so thank you for that little part of my history, as Nick did in his introduction. It's really been an honor to have you on and to listen to your worldview from a Philhellene's perspective. We're all going to rush out and get that book, Mythos and Heroes, and a few of the other storylines that you articulated. So Philhellene and being a Philhellene, in my vote of thanks, as David said, the Hellenic initiative 10 years ago was formed out of frustration and desperation that the world did not get Greece. And you talked about Britain and what it's been going through with its branding, that great British Empire that gave me my language as well as my Greek skills. Here we are, with Greece and its rebirth, and the diaspora and Philhellenes like you are very key to us, and that's what this hour has been about. We're focusing on philanthropy. We've raised $17 million. We've fed over 2.7 million households. We've really helped Greece through the refugee crisis, the pandemic, and now the fires, present day, right, with the heat wave. And we're actually just mounting now an effort to help cope with the current crises. Our wonderful country, our mother country, lurches from crisis to crisis, but who doesn't? And so if we don't glue it all together through your words and your inspiration and create generational growth, job creation, we've created over 2,000 jobs, we've created over 5,000 internships. The youth of Greece will be the drivers of that rebirth. Your wisdom, your words, and you are in the business of articulating words and stories, as you said, is very key. And so what you've done here today is basically put an exclamation mark on the 200-year revolution anniversary, and your words, we do owe Greece more than they owe us. And remember what this culture has given us. I got goosebumps when you said that. And so thank you. Thank you from all Greeks, Hellenes, and Philonines for being part of this wonderful session.
Efaristopouli, thank you so much. Thank you all. Thanks for tuning in, everyone who has, and good luck, and Kalinikta from this end of the world, and Kalimera to you, and Yassus and Yasum and all the other things. It's been a real pleasure, and good luck to that initiative, and good luck to Greece. And I'll be back both to Australia and Greece as soon as I possibly can be.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Bless you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.